This morning we are beginning a new sermon series. Today's message will be the first in a six-part series examining the six sources of our Unitarian Universalist faith. Now, I am not a math guy, but I've done the arithmetic, and to cover six sources in 6 weeks, I will have to average, give or take, one source per Sunday. So today I will be examining the first of our six sources, but I also need to invest some time talking more broadly about the origin of our list of sources and the role that that list plays in our faith. So to that end, let me start with reiterating a very important element of our corporate identity as a people of faith. As I shared earlier this morning, Unitarian Universalism, or UUism, is not a creedal religion. Rather, we are a covenantal religion. And what that means is that we are bound together by mutual promises, not mutually shared beliefs. And the mutual promises that we make with one another, we call these covenants. And as Unitarian Universalists, or UUs, we have several covenants, not just one. At UUCJ, I would actually suggest we have three very important covenants. First, like many UU churches, we at UUCJ have a unique covenant that we ask all our members to officially agree to. As a church community, we revisit that covenant every time we celebrate some of our newest members, which happens about every 3 to 6 months. I also made sure to highlight that covenant earlier this morning during the welcome and announcements. This is the covenant that contains our promise to enhance our lives together in this sacred space and to celebrate the diversity within our midst, even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. Now, the second big covenant for UUCJ is the one that we all reaffirm at the end of every service on Sunday. We often call this covenant our spoken affirmation, and it starts with the words, "Love is the doctrine of this church." Now, you don't have to be a member of UUCJ to join us in affirming this covenant every week. Anyone can recite it and choose to live by it. In fact, I wish more of us did. Now, finally, our third major covenant is the one that binds this congregation, UUCJ, to other Unitarian Universalist congregations that make up the Unitarian Universalist Association, or the UUA. This covenant is not a covenant made by or between individuals. Rather, it is the covenant that this entire church body made corporately with all other UU churches. And this covenant is found in Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. It also happens to be found at the beginning of our gray hymnals. So I'm going to invite all of us this morning to take our gray hymnals. I know not everyone has one, so you might have to look over someone's shoulder. And it's near the beginning. I'm going to find the page for you, because I'm going to ask us all to read this covenant together. This is what it looks like here on this side. It starts in all caps, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association." I'm going to allow you all to find that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask our worship associate, Sharon, to help me here, because we're going to read this antiphonally, which is a big fancy church word that basically just means we're going to read it as an alternating responsive reading. So here's how this is going to work. The parts in all caps, all of us will read together. Then the next phrase, which ends at a semicolon, will start with this side of the congregation saying it with me. The following phrase, up to the semicolon, will be led by Sharon on this side of the congregation. You get it? We can do this. I know this will work. So here we go. We're all going to read the part all in caps, and then we'll split off. So here we go. "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Altogether, this part, the living tradition we share draws from many sources.
Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and the openness to the forces that create and uphold life.
Words and deeds of prophetic women and men which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love.
Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ineffable spiritual life.
Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves.
Humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit.
Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. And let's all sing this, or do this last part together. Grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. Thank you, Sharon. And one quick note, some of y'all got confused at the end there because something was missing in some of y'all's hymn books. I'm going to explain that in just a second, so don't worry, the explanation will be forthcoming. Now, what we just read there, this is our associational covenant. In other words, UUCJ has promised to do all that with every other UU congregation in our association. Now, for those of you that are deep into the UUism, you immediately recognized embedded in this covenant two important UU doctrines, the 7 principles and the 6 sources. Last year, I delivered a sermon series on the 7 principles. It is available online and at our website or our YouTube channel. Now, at the beginning of that series last year, I went in depth regarding the origin of this associational covenant. And for the sake of time this morning, I'm not going to go super in depth today, but I will need to revisit a little bit of it, just briefly, so that we're all grounded in our understanding of the function of our principles and these 6 sources. So some of this is new to you, some of y'all know this very well. But Unitarianism was a Christian theology that came into existence nearly 2,000 years ago. Universalism was another distinct Christian theology that also came into existence nearly 2,000 years ago. Over the centuries and millennia, many Christians called themselves Unitarians or Universalists, and that also included America. So around 1960, the modern American version of the Unitarians and the modern American version of the Universalists merged to form the Unitarian Universalist Association, or the UUA. And as part of that merger, the Unitarians and the Universalists created a set of bylaws putting forth the new association's principles and purposes. Now, the attempt to write bylaws that both the Unitarians and the Universalists could agree upon resulted in a great bloody war in which many lives were lost. It was a dark, dark time for us. But in the end, the Unitarians and the Universalists reached a compromise. And like all good compromises, it was universally hated by everyone. But that compromise lasted for a couple of decades, and then in 1985, that compromise was replaced by what we just read, essentially, at least very close to it. There have been some minor revisions since 1985, but pretty much what happened in 85 is what we have today, and amazingly, those words were voted up nearly unanimously, which never happens amongst UUs where you get something happening unanimously. So why is all of this important for us to know today? Well, because I want us all to firmly understand that Unitarianism is thousands of years old. Likewise, Universalism is thousands of years old. And this modern American association of merged Unitarians and Universalists was born in 1961. And the 7 principles and 6 sources of that modern association were born in 1985. And here's the explanation for why some of you are missing that last 6th source. In 1985, only 5 sources were agreed upon. The 6th source was added in the mid-1990s. So some of our hymn books predate the mid-90s, and some of them came out after the mid-90s. So some of you had a 6th source, some of you did not. Some Unitarian Universalists believe that the 7 principles and 6 sources are a vastly important part of our faith. Other UUs cite the principles and sources as a relatively recent invention that does not and cannot define our faith. As good UUs yourselves, y'all are free to make up your own mind on that question. But I do want to point this out. When a UU is asked by a non-UU, "What are you?" many of us will immediately cite the 7 principles to help explain who we are. And personally, I think that might be a bit of a mistake. Instead of using the 7 principles to explain who we are succinctly, we might be better served using the 6 sources. You see, the 7 principles have some lovely language in them, but they don't really serve to specifically and concretely separate us from any other organization, religious or secular. The 6 sources, on the other hand, represent just about every major stream of philosophy and theology within our faith movement. The first source, where we talked about direct experience, that first source appeals to mystics and religious naturalists. The second source appeals to our social justice warriors. The third source appeals to those who incorporate the wisdom and practices of other faith traditions, including from the Far East. Do we all know what a Buddhist Unitarian Universalist calls themselves? A Buyu. They do. I know lots of proud, self-proclaiming Buyus. The fourth source appeals to Christian and Jewish UUs. And if Buddhist UUs are Buyus, do we know what Jewish Unitarian Universalists call themselves? Juyus. They do. I know several people who say they're Juyus. The fifth source appeals to humanists, atheists, and agnostics, and the sixth source appeals to pagans, witches, and those who engage in the religious practices of Native American and indigenous peoples. So taken together, those 6 sources paint a far better, far more accurate, a more detailed and meaningful snapshot of the depth, breadth, and diversity of Unitarian Universalism than just about anything else, including the 7 principles. So as we begin our study of these 6 sources, I also wish to note that it is my belief, at least, that the 6 sources should be considered, and frankly, can only be understood collectively. That is to say, they cannot be severed from one another and still retain their meaning. The meaning of the 6 sources is acquired only by understanding the 6 sources together in the relationships they share with one another, and that is because each source creates certain natural tensions with the others, and in that tension is balance and harmony. For example, the first source exalts direct experience steeped in transcendence and awe as a means of truth acquisition. This stands in contrast to the fifth source, which lauds science and reason as a primary modality for apprehending truth. Now, both the first and the fifth sources have historically stood in tension with the fourth source because many fundamentalist Judeo-Christian traditions teach that divine revelation is closed, and so any revelation of truth outside the 4 corners of the scriptures would be of dubious validity. This traditional belief puts tension between the fourth source and the third source, which draws from all world religions, and the sixth source, which involves the earth-centered traditions. But the second source, dealing with the prophetic men and women that move us towards justice, that has a close kinship to the fourth source, especially the Jewish prophets, including a rabbi and troublemaker named Jesus. I could go on, and I won't, but I could go on. The point is, we can't really study any one source in isolation from the others and expect that to be meaningful or useful toward our understanding of Unitarian Universalism. Now, with that said, I'm now going to focus entirely on the first source today. But before I do, let me say this. What each of us accepts as true or wise on our spiritual journeys, that doesn't necessarily have to square with all of our sources, but by the same token, hopefully, the truth and wisdom we choose to anchor our values to won't consistently come from one single source either. Each of us, of course, will find certain sources more persuasive than the others. But the reason we have all chosen Unitarian Universalism is because we want our individual spiritual journeys to happen in the context of a community filled with theological diversity. We want to worship and study and work alongside people who hold different beliefs, who prioritize these sources in a different order than we do. Now, if that kind of diversity is not what you're looking for, if you'd rather your spiritual journey be on a road with people who believe exclusively in the Christian and Jewish scriptures, or who exclusively identify as atheists or agnostics, or who exclusively practice a certain pagan tradition, that's perfectly awesome. Nothing wrong with that. But in all honesty, this UU church might not be the best place for you. So to the first source. Let me tell you this. The first source is the most dangerous of the six. And that is because direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder is kind of a fancy way of saying a personal connection to the divine or God. And a direct experience with the divine, that can change the world. Such direct experiences often lead to rebellion, reformation, or revolution. Direct experience is the realm of the mystics. It's also the realm of the religious naturalists, including transcendentalists. Now, transcendentalism was a 19th century movement that came out of American Unitarianism. And among its many tenets is a general belief that God or the divine is best understood experientially and individually in nature, rather than, say, through the study of books. In other words, transcendentalism is all about that direct experience. And most modern day UUs, we love the transcendentalists. But the irony is that the Unitarians originally kicked out all the transcendentalists. Two famous transcendentalists that Unitarian Universalists love to claim are Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. The problem is, though both started as Unitarians, they both rejected Unitarianism because Unitarianism essentially rejected their transcendentalist beliefs, which they acquired after having direct experiences with nature. Yet now, over a century later, we're all fixated on them, kind of like that very first girlfriend or boyfriend who dumped us and broke our heart and we never got over them. We love their transcendentalism now. We're all up in that first source. I mean, we at UUCJ, we've got a classroom named after Emerson. And look at these giant windows, right? I heard that actually some early UUCJers actually affectionately nicknamed the pond Walden 2. But the first source cuts two ways. As much as we pine over Emerson and Thoreau, there is another historical proto-UU who was also inspired by direct experience of the divine, yet his name is rarely ever spoken in the halls of UU sanctuaries. His name is Joseph Smith, founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith was the son of a Universalist. His grandfather was a Universalist minister. Smith's direct experience of the divine led him to create the Mormon Church. So why is Emerson and Thoreau's direct experience of the divine celebrated by Unitarian Universalists, while Joseph Smith's is not? I mean, where's the Joseph Smith classroom around here? Now, admittedly, and I speak only personally here, but admittedly, the idea that an individual translated scriptures from God off of golden plates buried by an angel named Moroni, personally, it's a little far-fetched for me. On the other hand, that belief isn't really any farther out there than a belief that an invisible Holy Spirit whispered infallible teachings into the hearts of the apostles regarding the virgin birth of a Messiah, or that the archangel Gabriel delivered sacred teachings to Muhammad in a cave, or that God on top of a mountain gave Moses a stone tablet with 10 really good ideas on it. So is Unitarian Universalism big enough to hold Jews and Christians and Muslims and Mormons? Many of the best people I've ever met are Jews and Christians and Muslims and Mormons. I've worked side by side with many of them in matters of both faith and justice. It also happens to be the case that some of the worst people I've ever met were Jews and Christians and Muslims and Mormons and Unitarian Universalists. And I've directly fought against some of these people in matters of both faith and justice. So the direct experiences that helped to create these faith traditions, including the direct experience of nature that helped birth transcendentalism, which later resequenced the theological DNA of Unitarians, those direct experiences don't seem to be the most important factor in determining who we can be in community with. And that's why it's so very useful to read instructions all the way to the very end. You see, the first source does not simply state direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures. There's another clause that follows and acts as a qualifier. Direct experience of the divine counts as a UU source only when that experience leads us to a renewal of the spirit and openness to the forces that create and uphold life. So not all direct experiences are equal. They don't all count as part of UU theology. UUs need accept only those direct experiences that lead us to say yes to life. If the experience leads to beliefs and behaviors that are destructive to life, then we are not compelled by our faith to accept or even tolerate it. So if believing in Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, Buddha, or Joseph Smith renews your spirit and opens you to the forces that create and uphold life, then certainly we can be in one accord. However, if believing in Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, Buddha, or Joseph Smith leads you to destroy and limit life, perhaps by oppressing other human beings, then we're going to have beef, and we're just not going to get along really well. As we prepare to close today, there is one last word of exhortation that I think is important for us Unitarian Universalists to keep in mind. Remember that the first source of our faith is direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder, not direct study of, not direct observation of, not direct conversation about over a cup of coffee. Our prime source is experiential. You've got to connect to the wonder and the awe, the breath-stealing beauty and grandeur and mystery of that which is greater than ourselves, however you choose to define it. Only then can we begin to understand the gratitude and the peace that will make sense and meaning of all the sources to follow. Blessed be.